months ago, I had never heard about Lincoln Cemetery or Henry Spradley. I didn't really know anything about black soldiers in the Civil War, or even about the history of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the great town where I go to college. But now, things are different. I feel like a real historian with an amazing story to tell. My name is Colin Macfarlane, and I'm actually a history major at Dickinson College. About 2 months ago, my class on advanced methods got an assignment. Use primary sources to find out about people who lived around here during the Civil War. Pretty simple, right? But it turns out not to be as easy as it sounds. Sitting in class, I heard about a park in town that used to be an African American cemetery where a few dozen black Union soldiers were buried. Then in the late 1960s, Lincoln Cemetery had become neglected, and after a series of court cases, the local government seized and redeveloped it as Memorial Park. They actually knocked down the headstones but left all the bodies in the ground. There were some protests and lawsuits, but pretty much all that remains to remember these brave men is one token headstone and some historical markers. I was shocked. But now, I knew what I wanted to do. I was determined to find out about one of those men who remains resting underneath that park, just a few blocks from my dorm. I wanted to help remember one of these figures on the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. Who knows, maybe even find his headstone and convince the town to restore it to its rightful place. My first stop was the Dickinson Library. That's one of the things my professor had really hammered home. You can't understand historical sources until you know more about the period, the people, and the context of the world they lived in. I needed to know when African Americans were able to join the Union Army, what positions they occupied, how they were treated, and where they served. I also needed to know how their service was remembered in northern towns like Carlisle. I soon learned that over 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army. Starting in late 1862, blacks began enlisting in segregated regiments eventually organized as the United States Colored Troops. In fact, many of these USCT regiments were trained right here in Pennsylvania, at Camp William Penn, just outside of Philadelphia. Many of these African Americans enlisted far from home, serving in federal rather than state regiments, and due to discrimination after the war, most of these veterans were not always memorialized or remembered properly. I now knew enough to put Lincoln Cemetery into historical context, but these books and articles tell a story of 180,000, and me, I was just looking for one soldier's story. So I was off to the Cumberland County Historical Society. The archivist there helped me find 3 folders on Lincoln Cemetery. Opening these folders was a little like opening up a treasure chest. First I found photos of Lincoln Cemetery taken by a man named Jim Bradley in 1971, which was right before the headstones were removed. The images show the landscape as it used to appear, before the days of Memorial Park. Then I pored over the maps of old Lincoln Cemetery and a listing of the graves compiled by a former Dickinson student named Susan Kavanaugh. This list shows the actual names on the gravestones still standing in 1971, including the exact days that many of them died. I left the Historical Society pretty happy with my maps, newspapers, photos, and especially with the list of veterans. Basically, I had a list of about 36 names, each one of them a veteran buried at Lincoln Cemetery, so I started searching each one of them in databases like Ancestry.com and American Civil War Research Database. I looked in old newspaper databases, archival collections at Cumberland County, and in the Dickinson archives too. I even spent hours staring at microfilm, reel after reel after reel. Looking through the microfilm reels of old Carlisle newspapers, I searched from one day before the death of each USCT veteran to about a month afterwards. I was looking for obituaries, but I was willing to take any article that would help. Hours and hours and a lot of caffeine later, the search started paying off. Headstone shipments for 5 veterans, a death and funeral notice for John Peck, and a small death notice for Alexander Washington, all of them Lincoln Cemetery soldiers. And then the moment came. I found an article in the Carlisle Herald on Henry W. Spradley, who was a member of the 24th U.S. Colored Troops and buried at Lincoln Cemetery. It reads, "Laid to rest. Deeply impressive services at Henry Spradley's funeral. The funeral services of Mr. Henry Spradley were held in Bosler Hall at 2:30 o'clock this afternoon. It was originally intended to have the obsequies in the West Street AME Church, of which the deceased was a prominent member, but that edifice would not have been sufficiently large to accommodate the attendance. Spacious Bosler Hall was completely filled with an audience composed of white and colored people. The college had been closed for the afternoon, and about half the audience represented the faculty and nearly the entire student body of Dickinson College, who had assembled to pay their last tribute to the deceased, who in life had been the venerable bell ringer and janitor of that institution. This was a really big deal. Henry Spradley clearly meant a lot to the church, the college, and the Carlisle community. I knew right away that his story deserves to be told. I just hoped that I was the right person to tell it. So with the obituary of Henry Spradley echoing in my mind, I searched everything all over again. I went back to the Historical Society, the Dickinson Archives, databases, image collections, and microfilm, but now looking for just one man. All had something to offer for Spradley's story. My search turned up census records, pension notices, regimental data, multiple obituaries, estate documents, a full burial record, and even images. Here is Henry W. Spradley in 1893. This photo, found in the Dickinson archives, captures the 63-year-old veteran just 4 years before his death. Finally, I had a face to put to one of the names, but who was Henry Spradley? It turns out he began life as a slave. Henry Spradley was born in 1830 in Winchester, Virginia. What happened to him as a young man remains mostly hidden, but Winchester was an important market town in the Shenandoah Valley, and was probably where Henry learned his trade as a stonemason. Winchester was also a community ripped apart by the Civil War, changing hands between Union and Confederate forces more than 70 times in 4 years. Many local slaves ran away during this chaotic period, and Henry was probably one of them. His obituaries claimed that he was a slave until emancipation, when he then moved with his family to Carlisle. But if he was a runaway, that would explain why he enlisted in the Union Army in 1865 under the name of Henry Williams. That whole name change really took me a while to unravel, but eventually I figured out that Private Henry Williams of the 24th United States Colored Troops was actually Henry W. Spradley of Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Henry was married in Virginia to a woman named Jemina, or Mina as she was called. They had 4 children, Elizabeth and William, who were born before 1863, and Emma and Shirley, who were born after the family had arrived in Carlisle. Spradley's regiment, the 24th Infantry USCT, was formed, organized, and trained at Camp William Penn, and spent most of their wartime experience guarding Confederate prisoners. They served in Washington, D.C., Point Lookout, Maryland, Roanoke, Virginia, and were finally mustered out from the former rebel capital at Richmond, Virginia. After the war, Henry Spradley returned to his family in Carlisle. He worked as a stonemason, became a leader of the local AME Zion Church, and was a member of the Grand Army of the Republic, a veterans organization, Carlisle Post 440. But what stunned me the most was that in 1879, Henry Spradley became the chief janitor of West College at Dickinson. Nicknamed Sprad by the students, he worked at Dickinson College for 18 years. After working so long at my own college, I was sad to read how he suffered from chronic rheumatism before finally dying of heart failure during the night of April 9, 1897. His funeral was attended by family, faculty, students, and fellow church members. They even suspended all classes at Dickinson that afternoon. The services were held in Bosler Hall, where I now take classes, and featured eulogies by multiple preachers, a student body representative, and members of the college faculty. The West Street AME Choir and the Dickinson College Quartet together sang "Safe in the Arms of Jesus," and he was later buried at the North Pitt Street Colored Graveyard, which later became Lincoln Cemetery and today is known as Memorial Park. I still haven't found Henry Spradley's headstone, but I do know where he was buried and an awful lot about how he lived and how many lives he impacted. He was a devoted father and husband. He was a great self-made man who came from slavery and became a figure loved and respected by whites and blacks in a town that didn't always treat people equally. From slave to soldier, from veteran to respected citizen, Henry W. Spradley lived a life worth remembering. I know for one that I will never forget this man or the lessons he has taught me about the real meaning of history.